Poetry is a way for individuals to express matters that are deep and personal to them in a way that is artistic, creative, and rhythmic. Poetry can be meant to be shared with others, and when this is done, poems serve as a living heritage and primary resource of experiences and events that come from multiple perspectives. I'm Olivia Powers, and today I'm going to talk briefly about some reasons why poetry should be used in social studies instruction. After reading through a number of articles and websites, I came up with the most common list of benefits as to why poetry is beneficial to use in social studies. The first one I'm going to touch on is creativity. Poetry helps to boost creativity in students. While using poetry in social studies, students would get exposed to the author's point of view and have many models to follow when writing their own poetry on a topic. Students would also get to share their own opinions on the topic that is being learned in a unique form of writing. Poetry is really a form of art that uses rhyme, verse, and freestyle that will allow students to get the chance to freely express themselves. On the screen are two examples of student-written poems about social studies topics. One of them follows a tune to the song of Yankee Doodle, and one is more of a free verse. Both examples show students expressing creativity while also demonstrating an understanding of the topic. Another reason why poetry should be used in social studies instruction is because it helps to develop empathy. Empathy is the ability to understand and share in others' feelings. Poetry is a great tool to develop empathy because it is a living artifact of the experiences and events of the past. In poems, people share how they have personally been affected by an event, and the reader is able to put themselves in the author's shoes and gain a sense of understanding for what they have gone through. Poems are also good to use for this because as teachers, it may be hard to fully get our students to understand the magnitude that an event had on a particular group of people or an area. And by using poems and listening to firsthand experiences, students are able to gain a better understanding of what the event was really like. On the screen is an example of a poem that could be used to help students develop empathy towards a man that was a slave. By reading this poem, they would be able to gain an understanding of how he feels and what he hopes for his family. This can also be used for students to really think deeply about events in history. Another reason that poetry is beneficial in social studies, which also ties into the last one, is that it teaches about cultural diversity and social justice. Poems are a good tool to use for this because the words in a poem come from the heart and have emotion tied into them. So it means more for students to read about them just reading out of a book, and it is better than the teacher lecturing about the topic. Reading poems about social justice issues like racial injustice or climate change may inspire students to write poems about their own feelings on an important issue. Using poems to teach students about cultural diversity and social justice allows them to really feel the impact and weight of these issues. Many poems address important strands of social studies education, like culture, ideals, change, and identity, and are a good way to connect learning of required material to real-life accounts. The next benefit to using poetry that I found is that it helps students acquire new information and vocabulary words. Poetry helps to expose students to words that they may have not been exposed to otherwise. Poems also put the vocabulary words in a very specific context, which helps students to remember the meaning better. In the example poem on this slide, if students were to read it, they would not only become more familiar with the culture of Pakistan from a child's perspective, but also learn more about the geographic location of Pakistan, the words salwar, kameez, glistening, embossed, and bangles. Poems help to create a mental visual image of what is really going on, and it is easier to bring the new vocabulary words into context and meaning. Another benefit of using poetry in social studies is that it helps to cultivate literacy. Poetry is a great resource to help bridge together two content areas, language arts and social studies. While using poetry to learn about important history topics, students are also practicing their reading fluency, interpretation skills, use of context clues, expression while reading, and connecting to prior knowledge, just to name a few. Poems can also be used as a group read aloud, partner read aloud, or individually. When reading poems in front of their classmates, or even just with a partner, students are gaining confidence in their literacy skills. Using poems as a different way to teach and read in social studies may motivate students to read and write since it is done in a more creative and fun way. The poem on the screen addresses things like identity and family differences while also working on language skills like opposites, repetition, fluency, and rhythm to the beat of a tune. Pretty much any poem could be used as an example of how literacy is cultivated even during social studies instruction. Reading a poem may also seem more manageable for students instead of reading out of a text or article. One last benefit One last benefit of using poems to teach social studies is that it encourages inquiry in students. After reading a poem, students are tasked with asking questions and trying to develop meaning for themselves about what the author is trying to convey or challenge them to do. When the teacher does not provide prompting before reading a poem, students are able to ask questions on their own and make inquiries. This will lead to students learning how to ask better questions, gain a deeper understanding of the topic since they are required to think more critically about it, and think of many possible meanings that the poem may contain. Using a poem about a historical figure like Rosa Parks, allow students to learn more about the person while also raising their own questions and inquiries about that person or event. The teacher may give students an inquiry question prior to reading a poem or instruct students to form their own. Either way, students are being tasked with analyzing the poem and developing meaning before being able to come up with an answer to an inquiry question. While researching this topic, I was able to come across a number of resources to use when teaching poetry. There are 3 specific ones that I would like to point out. The first one is an article titled Poetry for Social Studies, Poems, Standards, and Strategies. This is an article by Sylvia Vidal that was posted by the National Council for Social Studies. In this article, the author addresses many of the same benefits that I mentioned already, as well as give numerous examples of appropriate poems to use for different areas like culture, government, global connections, identity, etc. The next resource is a website called poets.org. This website is from the Academy of American Poets, and on this website there are numerous already made lesson plans based on poems that might be used on social studies topics. The third resource is an awesome list put together by Shailene Farnsworth, an educator and writer, and it gives 25 online poetry resources for teachers to find poems on. This would be a great place to begin looking for traditional and non-traditional poems to use in the social studies classroom. And here's a list of resources that I used while learning more about poetry and social studies.